Hey friends, my February reading was really satisfying, and so I am excited to dive into it today with a wrap up. Before we jump all the way in, hi, my name is Melody, and we talk about books and book adjacent things on this channel, and I would love for you to hang out more if you are not yet subscribed. But all in all, I read 9 books in February, and I'm really pleased with what I read. There were a couple of bumps, but still books that made me think or that I can have a conversation around. And so let's just go ahead and jump into it now. The first book I read in February was Then Came You by Lisa Kleypas. In yet another year of me failing to celebrate Derek Craven Day, I have still not read Dreaming of You despite the fact I own it, and this year I was really making an effort to make it happen. This was my first read of Then Came You, and I had a blast with it. I'm going to be very interested to see how I respond to Dreaming of You in comparison, because I actually saw a lot of parallels with Then Came You and my personal favorite in the Wallflowers series, It Happened One Autumn, even though Devil in Winter, which I still love as well, obviously, is the more fan favorite of that series. And so I will be very interested to see if I respond similarly to this duology in that I end up liking this first book better. Now, that being said, there, like in Devil in Winter, are still moments in this book where I know that this is a romance that comes from a previous time, in that there may be some things, especially with our hero Alex, where he's not always the nicest to our heroine Lily. However, this is a very ambitious and expertly paced historical romance. We tackle a lot of really big things in this, especially with Lily, who we start the book with as a kind of devil may care persona, and she is known as a big personality, kind of one of the boys in these upper crust circles, but we come to find out that she is hiding a lot of pain behind this persona, and our hero is able to kind of get underneath her skin in a lot of ways, and that kind of carefree attitude that is hiding a lot of things as she is endeavoring to break her little sister, who she hasn't seen in years because of her reputation. She is aiming to break her sister's engagement to this lord because she has decided they will not suit. And while Alex and Lily are often kind of oil and water, they definitely suit. And I definitely saw some precursors of Lillian and Westcliff from It Happened One Autumn in this book. It felt like a kind of earlier iteration of them in some ways, and it felt like a rawer iteration of them in some ways. Lily and Lillian are vastly different, but Westcliff and Alex feel like heroes of a similar mold, if I do still like Westcliff a little better personally. However, I really was drawn to a lot of the emotional vulnerability and rawness that were explored here, and a lot of the risks that this book took in terms of its heroine and its storytelling and what it was exploring. Another thing that really struck me, especially from the beginning of the book, and I think that carries throughout, and obviously the ending is very different, but Lily reminded me a lot of Lily Bart from Edith Wharton's House of Mirth, which I have text receipts of talking to a friend about this. And maybe I just see Lily Bart everywhere, but having done absolutely no research into it, I am inclined to believe that Lily Bart was an inspiration for Lily in this book, based on those parallels of how they move through society and how they are kind of at the whims of others within society. Now, Lily in Then Came You has a lot more agency, I would argue, and has a much different and better ending than Lily Bart, but it was interesting to think about those two in conversation. And again, as I mentioned, the pacing of this is just incredible. When I look at it and look at the page count and think about how much happens plot-wise in this book, both from like the mechanics of plot points and also the emotional kind of landscapes we are navigating through for these characters, their reversals and their evolutions, and how it is just seamlessly handled without anything feeling rushed. It is just top tier, and this is the kind of romantic pacing and emotional kind of fervor I thirst for, in terms of having that depth and that resonance and these big explorations while still feeling a little dangerous at times. I'm not endorsing everything that our couple gets up to here. However, I really enjoyed this book. Luckily, on the heels of that, I read another romance that I absolutely loved and that I will be discussing with my romance book club next weekend, finally. Unclaimed by Courtney Milan. I read this thinking we were talking about it at our last meeting and we didn't, so I am well ahead of the game for once. But I absolutely adored this one as well. I did it on audio based on what I could get my hands on within the time frame I thought I was operating within, and we are following Mark and Jessica. Mark is a kind of renowned celebrity of the day because he has written essentially a pamphlet about being chaste as a man, and it has taken over society, and there have been spawnings of different clubs that have started for gentlemen that are inspired by this tract, though they interpret it differently than Mark originally wrote it. And we're also following Jessica, who is a courtesan attempting to build a new life for herself. And the way that she is going to do this is by earning the reward money offered by a former protector for seducing Sir Mark, because this man wants to bring him down. He sees him as a political adversary and he wants a big scandal from Mark being kind of exposed in the public sphere as a phony and a fake. The problem with this is Mark isn't a phony and a fake. And so we have here a hero with a very strict moral compass who lives that moral compass for himself, but also calls out the hypocrisy of it in the everyday when he sees others kind of twisting his intent. For instance, when he goes to this small town, we see the kind of small town nature of things in the way that Jessica is already there and the way that they are responding to Jessica, who they believe is a widow, and he calls them out for excluding her or for judging her and the kind of woman they believe her to be simply based on small-mindedness. And he's also challenging these clubs that have popped up and the way that, as often happens in society, it is projecting onto women the foibles of men. And Mark is like, no, 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 it is our job to remain chaste and pure and to not be tempted. And so Mark has all of the strong personality of romantic leads that I really enjoy, while still being a kind of fresh and different iteration. And these characters are incredibly strong and are up against societal odds that are very real, especially in Jessica's case, and the kind of conflict within their relationship and whether their relationship will work. The community around them, particularly around Mark with his brothers, whose books I need to read after this because I loved it so much, and because even last weekend, one of my friends from book club was like, did you finish the rest of the series yet? And I had to say no. But it was just a really refreshing historical romance in terms of the kind of archetypes of romantic leads that we're seeing here, as well as the setting of it as we spend most of the book in a smaller town, and just the kind of considerations of the book and the social commentary on top of really strong character development was just top tier. And then, as discussed in a Feature Friday, I read Immortal by Sue Lynn Tan, which is her newest romantasy, following the young ruler of a mortal kingdom that is indebted to the celestial realm, and how this bargain of sorts brings her in contact with the god of war after she eats or consumes a magical flower that has been requested from the ruler of the celestial kingdom. And again, the explorations of the mythology and the celestial realms were really stunning here. The pacing was a little confusing for me at the start, in that we start off in something that feels kind of reminiscent or like it might turn into a Beauty and the Beast adjacent type convention of storytelling, but that is not at all what we are in. It is interesting because we are in a first-person point of view here, but we are in the first-person point of view of Leon, who knows the least over the course of the story. And so as a reader, that is very intentional in terms of keeping twists and turns from us, and Sue Lynn Tan's twists and turns in terms of plotting continue to be really delightful. And at the same time, it's also one of the biggest stumbling blocks, I think, of the narrative or challenges of telling this story, because it often feels like a lot of the emotional beats, particularly with Leon and the God of War, are really rushed. And as a reader, we don't know why. It just feels very thin and sometimes kind of juvenile because of that. And then some of the revelations later help make sense of what exactly is going on. And it's interesting because I feel like it was just a little bit more of something that I kind of had to suspend my disbelief around as a reader this go around than in Daughter of the Moon Goddess, which we know I adore, and I still need to read the rest of that series. But it felt like that lived a little bit more in the kind of fairy tale-esque realm, and this felt a little different because we were following a mortal first and foremost, and I did like how we kind of explored the different realms in this novel quite a lot. We had the celestial realm, and we had the human realm, and then we had another realm we got to experience, and I think the balance of that was really delightful, and I liked moving between those worlds. And then of course, because of that, we had the kind of rule of three in storytelling come into play, which is a kind of piece that puts it more back into the camp of fairy tale-esque. So maybe I should reserve some of that judgment. But I think if we'd had just a little bit more kind of diversity within the point of view, there were opportunities there, especially as this was a romance at its heart in a lot of ways. And I really kind of wanted to see that depth of emotion. I understand why the choices we made were made. I don't know that they always served the story, but they definitely served the revelations, if that makes sense. So definitely still a fun time, and if you like that fairy tale-esque nature, something to check out. And if you want to hear the more full-fledged thoughts on it, go ahead and check out that Feature Friday. Speaking of Feature Friday, this next book also has a Feature Friday, and that is The Queen's Spade by Sarah Raleigh, and I highly, highly encourage you to read this YA kind of thriller revenge story, historical thriller revenge story about Queen Victoria's African goddaughter Sally. And to be Queen Victoria's goddaughter, Sally, of course, was essentially kidnapped from her home as a princess in her own right, and reconciling that. And so this book reimagines her history through the lens of her taking revenge against the crown and all of those involved in her kidnapping. And it starts out very active, it's active throughout, and it's just a whole lot of fun. Here the first person feels very sharp and pointed and specific and really works within the story, especially as Sally's mission is so focused. And there are these moments of dark comedy that peek through. The characterizations are really interesting, and the social commentary on top of everything is impeccable, all within a really fast-paced young adult pacing that just works so, so well. I absolutely loved this. I would encourage you, of course, to pick up the book and also go ahead and check out the Feature Friday where I have more developed thoughts about it, but I really, really loved this one, so definitely please check this one out. And then I listened to Full Moon Over Freedom by Angelina M. Lopez, which is the second in the Milagro Street series, which started with After Hours on Milagro Street, which I adored and I read with my romance book club a couple of years ago now. And my only gripe with this book is that there is another sister and there is not a third Milagro Street book listed yet, and so that may be partially my fault because I'm just now getting around to this book. I will say one of the things I really enjoy about these books so far is there's this kind of hint of magical realism to them, and we have that here with La Llorona, and the hint also of like a wolf, maybe a Grimm-esque figure, and they are just kind of peripheral. They're very central to the inner lives of our characters, but as a reader they're not as central as like in a supernatural romance, so I don't want to mislead anyone in terms of the focus, but it's more kind of a metaphor for Jillian and Nikki's interiors. That being said, I did go in kind of expecting for some reason a shifter romance based on the blurb or some element of that. I expected the same kind of level of supernatural presence as we got in the first book, but that was not the case in terms of there were no shifters. There was just a Grimm-esque figure. However, we are following Jillian, who is in the middle of a divorce, a pretty nasty divorce, as she comes back to town, and she's kind of dealing with this conflict of her desires to kind of be an active part of her family again, and the legacy and responsibilities of the restaurant and what that represents, but also having the responsibilities to her children and what she could need to give up in order to kind of stave off her ex-husband, who is a real piece of work. And then we have Nikki, and Nikki and Jillian have a history, but their relationship was much more physical when they were younger and much more kind of hidden because Jillian was very focused on getting out of her town, of her small town, and making it big. And so there is a lot of kind of baggage there in terms of how these two characters interact with each other and the wider world, but there is still a lot of love and passion there. And Nikki is now a renowned artist with his own kind of emotional baggage at play, but he's kind of thrown into the mix when he is commissioned to do a mural for the museum that we see the beginnings of in the first book. And so the community of this book continue to be really excellent. I love getting to see the sisters from different points of view because Alex and Jeremiah are still very present here, obviously. The romance between Jillian and Nikki is a little messier because of a lot of that baggage and history, so they have a lot to kind of work through there, both within their kind of separate emotional realms and the kind of upsets that they've had in their life leading them back to each other, and then also kind of working through a lot of the resentments and history of the first go of their relationship and what that looked like. And so there was a lot of emotional depth here, and I have put her previous series that hadn't been on my radar somehow prior to this on my wish list on Libro.fm, so I definitely need to circle back to those. And if you've read them, I would love to hear your thoughts. I'm not expecting the magical realism elements necessarily in that series, but I am just really loving Lopez's voice. Side note, not related to February reading, it is like one of the first really nice weekend days in Chicago right now, which means that there's a lot of really loud vehicles outside. Next is my favorite book of the month, and that is, to no one's surprise, A Tropical Rebel Gets the Duke by Adriana Herrera, which is the third in the Las Leonas historical romance series, this time following Apollo and Aurora. And Aurora is the runner of an underground women's clinic in Paris, and Apollo is an erstwhile duke who does not have any ambitions to his title and is trying to kind of reconcile what it means to have this title and what it represents, and balance this kind of pushback and resentment for the aristocracy with the good he knows he can do for the people under him within the concept of this title. However, to do another callback to Devil in Winter, and we do have an entire feature Friday on this book, don't worry, we start the book with Aurora visiting Apollo, which is interesting and was a curveball for me as a reader that I should have expected, having been a reader of Devil in Winter, in that Aurora and Apollo have been kind of going at each other for the previous books. They very much do not get along in the sense that Apollo enjoys antagonizing Aurora. So there has always been a spark there, and we watch that spark ignite at the beginning of the book in what both characters believe to be a kind of one night only scenario. However, the minute that Apollo hears that Aurora has been offering her medical services to a brothel, he goes running on back to Paris, and in that discovers more of the realities of Aurora's clinic and the kind of healthcare she is providing to women, the danger of that, as she could be arrested for what she is doing. And so he provides her a safe place to practice medicine, as well as offers to host a kind of fundraising opportunity for her clinic. And of course, things develop a little more between the two of them, which at first they think is much more physically based. And believe me, there is physical basis. However, the emotions obviously are there as well. And this book is just an utter delight all the way around. The characterization here, the plotting, the kind of setting. Here we're back in Paris, which is a lot of fun, and I love the realms we are exploring within this book. And as I mentioned in the Feature Friday, I think there's something really special about having that kind of setting and that remove for both of them that is seen on a larger scale within the concept of Paris itself, and a smaller scale within Apollo's apartment, and the symbolism there, and the symbolism of Aurora having the key to his apartment from the very beginning. Because as the book itself says, oh yes, the two of them could be quite a revolution. And I have so many passages in this book marked because I absolutely adored it. So if you have not read this book yet, you need to read it. If you have not read this series yet, you need to read the whole series. I absolutely loved it. It really is some of the best historical romance of the last couple of years, in my humble opinion. But yeah, absolutely loved it. And then continuing with the theme of all of the Feature Fridays at once, we have The Favorites by Lane Fargo, which again, I have a dedicated video on, so I'm not going to speak too in depth here, but this is a reimagining of Wuthering Heights through the lens of ice dance and competitive ice dance. And it is really spectacular in terms of taking the form and taking Kathy and Heathcliff into a modern conception. It does adaptation so, so well. And I say this as a Wuthering Heights hater. I find Kat and Heath in this iteration slightly less exhausting than Kathy and Heathcliff. And I know there's a layer of judgment there. I know there is a lot of social commentary in Wuthering Heights. I'm not negating that by any means, but I think that I can still be exhausted by the angst of Kathy and Heathcliff at the same time. Here they have more of a place to kind of funnel that energy. I do think it's part of the original commentary, like where that is coming out, but I think that there is just a really excellent transposition of everything to my recollection, because it's been so long since I read Wuthering Heights. But one of the things I really appreciated was the kind of structure of it. So like in Wuthering Heights, we are not seeing Kathy and Heathcliff's story only from their point of view. We get peeks into Kathy's journals, to my recollection, but we are primarily seeing things from the third party coming into the story midway, as is very common in novels of that time. And here we are seeing that through the framing device of interviews, and this being told kind of as a documentary interspersed with Kat's first person point of view. So I think it takes, as I said in the Feature Friday, modern narrative conventions, and it utilizes them very specifically and successfully in conversation with the original source material. So it feels very much of the moment and for the moment for modern readers, while still having this layer of conversation and intertextuality that is just really excellent. Additionally, this structure really works to keep me as a reader going. It was incredibly compulsively readable. I understand absolutely where all of the hype for this book is coming, because it keeps us going from emotional high point to emotional high point, and sometimes that extreme episodic nature could be a stumbling block for me as well, because it didn't feel like we got a lot of the nuance of those emotions. However, at the same time, those are very specific choices to take us through the snapshots. All of the decisions here are incredibly intentional, and that is very obvious in the storytelling. And so we're able to talk about it in that way and on a higher level. I do think it's going to be still somewhat polarizing because of that, because we move very quickly. It is all the emotional highs, but I think that there's a lot of really interesting conversation that can be had around that. And so far, this is my favorite interaction with a Wuthering Heights adjacent kind of story that I at least can think of. So very much enjoyed this, and I think part of that goes back to the setting of the competitive ice dance world, which, as I mentioned before, is this kind of marriage of athletic skill and artistic expression, and the kind of layers of perception and how Kat and Keith are perceived on the ice versus off, the storytelling that transcends off the ice and the kind of blurring of the worlds, mixed with this really competitive environment where you can't really trust anyone, but at the same time, you are only spending most of your time with these people in this world, and the kind of cutthroat nature of it and the high stakes of that as well. And it just really explores that in a way where the world matches the emotions of Kat and Heath, which I think makes them make more sense in context. And so yeah, there's a lot to explore and to dive into with this one for sure. Okay, next I read Save Our Souls, The True Story of a Castaway Family, Treachery and Murder by Matthew Pearl. I did this on audio through the library because, as I mentioned before, my book club, or one of my book clubs, really appreciates a boat book. And so this seemed like a strong contender for a good boat book narrative, especially as we have this element of like a Swiss Family Robinson-esque family trapped on this island with a murderer because they were shipwrecked. And somehow we fumbled the inherent drama of all of that. I don't know if it's that we didn't have enough to say. I don't know if there wasn't enough research to kind of stand on its own without fleshing out too much into the realm of fictional if we veered too much, because we did take some kind of side quests that I think would have been interesting if they had rooted us back to the main narrative in terms of like the sketchy backgrounds of some of the characters involved with this shipwreck. There were times where it felt like it really wanted to be the wager and it just wasn't. And that's kind of sad because there is inherent drama to this story. And while I respect not kind of over editorializing the historical record, there were moments where it felt like it wanted to move into those kind of narrative instincts, because my history with Matthew Pearl, admittedly I had not read him before, but is a fiction, or is as a fiction author, most known for me as the author of the Dante Club, which, as I mentioned before, I used to walk around at the library all the time while shelving, and I checked it out multiple times and just never got around to reading it. And so I know that the narrative instincts are there, and I saw peaks of them, and I respect not going fully into the fictional recounting, but at a certain point I wonder if the fictional recounting would have been more interesting than what we got here, because it just felt very thin. And I don't know if it was like a creative license issue. Again, I don't know if it was a historical record issue. It didn't really succeed in making me care about what was going on. And it also felt very short. It felt like a really rushed story that wanted to kind of draw out the drama, but didn't effectively. And again, there are a couple of options about why that was, or why that would be. I think that the biggest thing I took away from this was that The Swiss Family Robinson was not authored by one specific individual, or that it was kind of more of a living document or living tale in a lot of ways within this era, which I found fascinating. And now I just kind of want to read a book about the literary history of the Swiss Family Robinson in the public consciousness more than anything. So I don't know. This was a miss for me. I think if you haven't yet read The Wager, just read that. I think if you have read The Wager, this isn't going to bring anything to the table for you necessarily. Still, absolutely give it a shot if it sounds of interest, but I really would have liked to see it deepened and fleshed out. At the end of the day, like I said, it just felt very surface level and thin, and I would have liked more from it. And then finally I read Filthy Rich Fae by Geneva Lee. I had not read her previous series, which was a question a friend had for me when I mentioned that I had read this book and was trying to explain my reaction to it. It feels very reminiscent, or at least felt very reminiscent at the start of the book, of kind of urban fantasy romance of the 2000s, and I feel like that's kind of where it's stemming from, even if the structure is much different. I think that if I had gone in knowing that this was going to continue within the arc of this story over multiple books, I would have reacted differently to the pacing, because the pacing was making me incredibly frustrated in this book. Or maybe I would have reacted the same, because it feels needlessly kind of spread out in a lot of ways. It's kind of like Candy in that it didn't particularly feel like good or good for me or particularly well done necessarily, but I still read all of it. So I think the world building was just a little wonky. Everything just kind of felt kind of thin because it wanted to get us to like the trope points that hit, so to speak. I don't want to say fanfiction as a derogatory, because I think that there's a lot of really well developed fanfiction, as there are a lot of poorly developed and written books outside of the kind of overlap in any way. However, when I say that here, kind of what I'm drawing from is this idea of these thinner drawn worlds, which makes sense and work within fanfiction because we are kind of operating under the same schema, whether it be the fandom, whether it be in canon, or the kind of out branches of canon, or the accepted deviations. And so we're all kind of coming from the same understanding in a lot of ways, or that have been developed and built up within the fandom over the years in works. Here, I guess it could be argued that the iterations and development of the conception of fae within romance from like the 2000s, if we're going back to like Karen Marie Moning, the Karen Marie Moning school, through within the last decade or so that we've seen, I think it could be argued that maybe that's operating similarly, in that a lot of these scenes and the kind of wish fulfillment-esque scenes, or the scenes where we're like getting to those moments that we enjoy without the character development and world building feeling as strong, are because we are coming from this understanding of the kind of agreement that we've come to as readers within this realm. However, I would argue that that social contract is much thinner in fiction, especially if it's fiction that I am presumably paying for, because I read this on Kindle Unlimited when it became available, but I had it on hold at the library at one point, and the library had to buy it. So if I was paying money for this, I would be a little more frustrated. I also want to emphasize that there are similar works back to the 2000s, before fanfiction was as mainstream in the modern conversation, still present, still prevalent, but a much different beast for sure than now in terms of like its acceptance in the everyday. So there are times where this feels kind of like throwback to like Anita Blake and things of that ilk as well, which could also be very thin on the ground. So it's not a perfectly fair comparison by any means, but I feel like it might be the closest kind of conception. But we are dealing with, you know, a heroine that goes to make a deal with the Fae, and she's pulled into this world and kind of caught up with the leader of the Fae and his sister as a friend, and kind of operating in this world as other courts are coming in, as there are power plays being made, etc., etc. And so a lot of it is about the sexual tension between our leads here. I will say I'm glad it is a series in the sense that there are some things that were clearly set up to pay off that didn't pay off at any point in the book, to the point where it was starting to frustrate me. So I'm glad that there are multiple books, because clearly that's being set up for later. So there is some setup and some forethought, and these are kind of fun and frothy still. There's just also a kind of lack of substantial world and character development. That being said, I seem to be in the minority in that opinion, and I still, like I said, read the whole thing. So I will be interested to see if I feel compelled to pick up the second book. We will have to see together, I guess. But if you have read any of these books, I would love to hear your thoughts, because those were all of the books that I read for February. And like I said, it was a really enjoyable reading month. While the last two might not be the highest on my list, I still had a good enough time with them, in the sense that I had something to engage with and I clearly have opinions about them. But the beginning of this month was just really, really stellar, and I'm really hopeful for a similar march in terms of reading excellent things, which I think I am on track to succeed in. And then from there, not to get too far ahead of myself, but last year, March was kind of like my best reading month, and I'm just terrified of that happening again this year, especially because April through the beginning of May are going to be really wild for me, getting ready for my brother's wedding. So I'm just hopeful that after all of that craziness dies down, that I'll be able to get back into the swing of things, and March will not be the kind of pinnacle of my reading for 2025 again. I mean, I'm hopeful for a pinnacle of reading in March, don't get me wrong. I'm just hoping to keep that party going as well. So like I said, if you've read any of these books, let me know what you thought. Thank you for hanging out and listening to my thoughts. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good, and yeah, bye.